Hello. So I make no apologies for this somewhat brusque title. It is, after all, what Bezad asked us biologists to do. So the initial call described deep neural nets as inefficient, brittle, and inaccurate because they make mistakes like this, and that was unacceptable. The call also provided a suggested solution, which was to make representations that were hierarchical and compositional. So on this project, rather than trying to do more experiments on the brain, we neuroscientists are already drowning in data, so we don't really want more of that. Our role is to listen, learn a new vocabulary, translate biological findings into the machine learning domain, and to point out where the differences lie, expressed in the language of machine vision and not biology. So here's my final slide. I think it's always good to know where a talk will land up. I have two suggestions for machine vision experts, i.e. the things that I think biology does and you could quite easily do, but as far as I understand it, you're not doing yet. The first is to grow your representational space gradually and do this as you expand your range of tasks. The two go hand in hand. Second, you should stop trying to perfect one-shot recognition of images. Instead, switch your attention to the problem of recognition across a long sequence of snapshots. So this is the most important slide of the talk. It's critical of the way neuroscientists think about the brain as well as the way the deep neural network research is done. So the cortex does just one simple thing at a time, a bit like an artist painting one blob of paint at a time. The remarkable achievements of the brain or a painter occur over long sequences of actions, whether those are real or virtual. A different analogy to make the same point is that the neural machinery we study is primarily aimed at putting one Lego brick onto another. But the interesting aspect of the brain or Lego is what it can build out of many bricks, i.e. many epochs or sensory motor loops. We need to concentrate more on what the canvas is and what the Lego manual is for building the helicopter and stop focusing on the single brush stroke or putting two Lego bricks together. And it seems to me that machine vision suffers from a similar problem. So just to reiterate, if you read much of the neuroscience research, you would think that the cortex can do quite magical things. It can't, at least not all at once. It's doing things bit by bit. So here's a paper that we discussed previously, and it shows that recognition builds up across saccades. Eye movements are about hypothesis testing. This puts the focus on the reference frame the brain uses to relate these snapshots that you get by focusing on one bit of the face. And deep neural nets provide the snapshots, as does the cortex. But the reference frame is something we should focus on, both in neuroscience and in machine vision research. Abhinav showed us an example early in the MURI that was about the spatial distribution of snapshots. An analysis of video sequences addresses some similar issues. So this is also from Abhinav's group. It's a quadcopter learning policy network. And what it learns can be described in a similar way to what is learned in biology. The penultimate layer of the network has 4,096 units, so we can describe the stored feature vectors in a 4,096 dimensional space, and also the current vector. So with proximity in that space determining what action the quadcopter takes. The choice of actions in the brain can be described in the same way. The space might have higher dimensions, but we have the current state vector given by the firing of parallel fibres in the cerebellum, and stored feature vectors encoded by the Purkinje cells. And we've known about this for a very long time. Here's a very important slide, but I've been through it in previous MURI, so I won't linger on it here. Essentially, if you want to build a basis set for your feature vectors that is human-like, you will need to train your network differently, not just showing it lots of pigs and aeroplanes. Instead, building up gradually higher dimensions in your representation as you learn more sophisticated tasks. And that will make your representation compositional in a natural, task-dependent way. So our lab studies the representation of 3D space and navigation, and the ideas I've been talking about apply very much to the representation we believe the human visual system uses, namely that it's hierarchical, compositional, and based on a policy network. A policy network that's the instantiation of the canvas I've been talking about. The basis of 3D vision is an eye or camera rotating about the optic centre, which is essentially where a baby starts from. So this is an eye looking in one direction, and then it makes a saccade and looks in another direction to fixate a different object. And this you can describe as a policy network where the action is a saccade, S, the sensory state is the current image, G, the goal is the desired image. You can put these all together. The whole policy network describes an egocentric representation of space. And we can add to that head translations. So now the action is different. The action is head movement. S is still the current image. G is the desired image still, but we're moving across a surface of images now, generating optic flow as we go. But we're still thinking about it as a policy network. And we can think about two aspects of this. One, how you would represent the 3D structure of the outside world, and that's shown in this video, an eye moving around with the purple bricks being far away, the blue cyan objects being close, and how might you know that those were close if you were a baby, and why would you reach out and try and touch the blue cyan objects but not the purple ones? Well, you can think up a simple heuristic. The cyan ones are sliding around all over the place compared to the purple ones, which are rigid despite head movements, and that tells you which ones are close. But it's not. Why is this compositional? Because you're doing something very basic, very crude, and the information is still there to do something more sophisticated with the optic flow, but it's hierarchical. You can use simple heuristics to do simple things. So here's a picture of a woman looking out over the mountains. The only thing that can change the image for her is rotation of the camera, of her eyes. Translation causes no effect, and that makes it particularly dangerous. Anyway, in this sense, the set of images that she gets are the same as for the baby. And this set of images are, in computer vision, part of the plane at infinity. And that's a good starting point for a representation of 3D space. Here are two locations, A and B. For example, the woman moving to the left and right a bit, and the distant mountains. And here's a negative log likelihood that the observer is at location A, shown in blue, or at location B, shown in red. The likelihood does not refer to a coordinate, it refers to a sensory stimulus, in this case the set of angles between pairs of points visible from that location. If the only things that are visible are the mountains, then this sensory stimulus changes very slowly with changes in location, i.e. these are very shallow functions, and it's almost impossible to distinguish locations A and B. So this just shows a close-up version of these functions around A and B. But now look what happens when we add some near points into the scene, these black crosses. We recalculate the likelihood functions, and they're completely distinguishable now. It's easy to tell whether you're at A or B. That means we've generated a hierarchical compositional representation of space, and we've done it without using a coordinate frame. We're just looking at the hypothesis that you're at A or B, starting from a coarse description where you can't distinguish these two, adding more information and until you can distinguish the two very easily. So that's not true of the type of representation that we saw generated from reinforcement learning that Abhinav talked about towards the beginning of this MURI, where this is a TSNE of the feature vectors that are generated in that representation, and there is some information about the location of the camera, but not very much. And that's in contrast to the type of representation I've discussed just now, where if we look at the feature vectors corresponding to a grid of cameras in the center, which I've expanded here, then they're in a high dimensional space, and if you do a TSNE of those feature vectors, then they vary smoothly in that space, corresponding to a smooth change in this 2D plane. I want to finish by showing 3 quick slides on experiments that we've been doing. This is one on the combination of vision and touch using this apparatus. This is Mark Adams's project, where we can show visual and haptic stimuli separately or together, and measure the ability of people to judge the location of this object in the center relative to the plane defined by the other 3 objects. Essentially, take-home message: if this is the combined cue sensitivity when you have both vision and haptics, and the prediction using the worst cue or the best cue, the sensitivity seems to be somewhere in between and rather far away from the predictions of maximum likelihood estimation. So here's an experiment in which we found a better match with predictions of MLE. In this, there's a combination of visual information and proprioception. That's information from walking and from vergence. And the task was to judge the visual direction of an object that you've seen before, and then after you walk, you judge which direction that object would be in. And in this paradigm, we separate out visual cues from proprioceptive cues and measure the sensitivity to each, and that means that we can predict the direction judgments when both cues are combined. So that's what's plotted on the y-axis, people's actual a judgment of visual direction when both cues are available, and this is the prediction given that we know the sensitivity to each cue, and there's a remarkably good relationship between those two. So this is the last experiment, which we're still finishing, and it explores the way that people return to a location that they've visited before, i.e. It's a homing task. We've arranged it so that they can't do this by image matching. They can't just hunt around until they see the same image that they saw at home. And we do this by restricting the field of view. You can see on the left these cones, which are pointed in a given direction in a world-centered coordinate frame. So they're always looking north, or in the second interval when they're hunting, they could always be looking west. And then we record the locations. They press the button when they think they've got back home. And here are the results. These are all plotted in a coordinate frame in which the x-axis is the visual direction that they were looking in the first interval when they first saw the room. And what you can see is a consistent bias over, this is 1,500 trials across different participants. There's a consistent bias in that direction. So we tried repeating the experiment to see if we could get rid of this bias using a different mask. So these cones that you could look through, we made a double cone, so the red cone on the left here. People could look in 2 directions, but then in the second interval when they were hunting for home, the cone was flipped by 90 degrees, and you again could look through these two different cones, but you could know it was still the case that you could not do image matching. You couldn't look for the image that you had seen originally. So these are the data I showed you before, and this is what happens with the double cone. Essentially, there's no difference. It's still a significant bias, and it's still in the same direction, and the extra cone doesn't change that. So, as I said at the beginning, here's the summary. What you should do: you should grow your representational spaces gradually, and you do that as you gradually expand your tasks. And that's what's done in biology. And this leads to a naturally compositional structure. I've given examples from evolution and from the compositional representation of space. Stop trying to perfect the one-shot recognition of images. You're already doing plenty good enough. What you need to do instead is switch your attention to the problem of putting all these sequences together. You do rough and ready texture recognition in one patch, then the next patch, then the next patch, and if those all confirm your hypothesis, then you know you've recognized an object. But to do that, you need a canvas of some sort, like I've been talking about for rotations of the eye and translations of the eye. It generates a task-independent representation. It's like a base camp for climbing other mountains, for doing other task-dependent strategies. And I've talked about that. This sphere, this egocentric representation is a good example of a canvas that's implemented as a policy network. Okay, thanks very much to everyone who's done the work, and thank you for listening.